Batman might not be DC's darkest hero, but you'd struggle to find a worse place in the publisher's universe than Gotham City. The East Coast's urban dystopia is home to more freaks and monsters than most of the comic book cities put together, and while they're usually all a riot to read about, sometimes their evil can get a bit, well, overwhelming. There are the usual suspects that everyone tends to focus on, and while most tend to rank Batman's rogues based on how compelling they are as characters, there's something simple and slightly more terrifying in ranking them based on how straight up nasty they are. Naturally, as the medium progressed from the Silver Age of comics and into the Bronze and Modern Ages from the 70s onwards, so too did the Caped Crusaders' antagonists. They got more inventive, more tenacious, and often more deadly. I'm Ewan, this is What Culture Comics, and here are the 10 most evil Batman villains. Number 10, The Broker. As far as Batman villains go, the Broker is by far one of the most underrated in the character's library. How so? Well, he was only introduced a decade or so ago, but he serves a valuable purpose. He procures hideouts for villains. Paul Dini's time at the forefront of DC's Bat books in the late noughties tends to fly beneath the radar, but the B-Task alum came up with some really clever ideas during it. With The Carpenter and then The Broker, Dini addressed how Gotham's criminals managed to create their elaborate hideouts, with the former building them and the latter effectively serving as an estate agent and go-between for criminals to find their perfect lair. Predictably, The Broker is not a nice man. He's professional, cold, and doesn't care about what goes on in his properties once the deal's been made, kind of like a real-life landlord. To him, whatever happens after he's facilitated a transaction isn't relevant, despite the fact him letting property to Gotham's criminals has presumably led to the deaths of hundreds. Number 9, Zsasz. As far as premises for Batman villains go, Zsasz is actually relatively simple. He's a deranged serial killer with an insatiable appetite for murder, notching each victim on his body with a tally mark. Given there are hundreds of marks on his body, that puts the body count up there with the worst serial killers in world history. The true horror behind Zsasz isn't so much the quantity of people he's killed, but his rationale behind it. Zsasz genuinely believes he's doing the right thing, seeing himself as some divine liberator freeing people from the burden of life. Zsasz has gotten up to all sorts of nasty stuff over the years, but maybe his worst moment came during Streets of Gotham. The comic, written by Dini and featuring art from Dustin Nguyen and Derek Friedolfs, saw the villain given financial backing to carry out his evil acts, running a fight club with homeless orphan children and butchering them at the nearest opportunity. The comic also reveals how Zsasz perceives those around him, dead bodies drowned in blood. Number 8, Scarecrow. It takes a nasty piece of work to turn someone's worst fears against them, but that's exactly what Scarecrow, the man formerly known as Dr. Jonathan Crane, gets up to when he's out and about. Introduced in World's Finest Comics number 3 in 1941, Crane experienced trauma as a child and became obsessed with fear. Majoring in psychology, Crane took up a position at Arkham Asylum, where he proceeded to torture his patients with all sorts of fear experiments, eventually getting fired, becoming the supervillain we know and love today. Everything about Scarecrow screams pure evil. I mean, just look at the guy. He dresses up like a nightmarish distortion of the character from The Wizard of Oz, delights in realizing people's worst fears, and has concocted a formula to make it happen. The only reassuring thing about Scarecrow is that his illusions aren't real, but even then, so many of his victims can find themselves being driven mad by the ordeal. Point being, he is particularly evil, and a villain who's managed to etch himself into the annals of Batman's history by being needlessly cruel at every step. Number 7, the Flamingo. A villain from the days of Batman Reborn, the Flamingo is a flamboyant mercenary who, despite appearances, is well and truly in the top tier of horrifying Batman villains. Although just another hitman, Flamingo is actually quite the exceptional individual. He has a gimmick for the ages, donning an all-pink matador getup complete with all sorts of weaponry. And while his appearance doesn't exactly intimate a fear factor, the assassin's reputation precedes him. Why? Well, once he's killed his victims, he has a tendency to eat their faces. Yep, eat their faces. Don't need to say anything else really, do I? Number 6, Jane Doe. Introduced in 2003 by writer Dan Slott and artist Ryan Sook, Jane Doe is a serial killer who stalks her victims before killing them and assuming their identity. She pioneered wearing other people's faces long before Hush burst onto the scene, and is an expert in surreptitious entry. She successfully assumed identities for months at a time, striking at further victims from these positions, making her almost impossible to predict and apprehend. Apart from the fact that Jane's normal face is literally nothing but her exposed muscle, her most terrifying feature is that she does what she does to get lost in someone else's life, to the point where she even believes she's her victim. The thought of being killed and someone then stealing your life afterwards is absolutely horrifying, and a fear Jane Doe realizes in scary detail. Number 5. Black Mask. Apart from the mask, there was nothing much to distinguish Black Mask from Batman's other mob boss enemies. He was about as brutal as the Falcones and the Maronis, your Rupert Thornes and your Roland Daggetts, but he needed something else to give him the edge. Turns out that something else involved him being really into making people suffer, with his most heinous act occurring during War Games, an arc that saw Black Mask attempt to assume control of all of Gotham's crime families. Determined to discover Batman's role in the ensuing gang war, Black Mask apprehends Stephanie Brown, then going by the identity of Spoiler, and tortures her until she reveals the information. It's a gruesome, overdrawn sequence that leaves Stephanie at death's door, but it wouldn't be the only time Mask displayed his capacity for sadism. During a confrontation with Catwoman, he once kidnapped Selena Kyle's brother and sister, killed the brother, and forced her sister to eat the corpse. And I just threw up in my mouth a little bit. Number 4. The Mad Hatter. If not for the modern age of comics, Mad Hatter probably wouldn't make his way onto this list. Although obviously a supervillain his entire life, his original appearances showed the character engaged in typical Silver Age hijinks typified by his obsession with the works of Lewis Carroll. Unfortunately, decades later, writers reimagined the villain with a horrifying new edge, relating to his obsession with children. Tetch has been known to kidnap runaway kids, dress them up as characters from Alice in Wonderland, and keep them sedated so that they can never escape. It doesn't take much explaining to see just how twisted that is, but Hatter's evil doesn't stop there. In fact, it was heavily implied in the pages of Arkham Asylum: A Serious House on a Serious Earth that Jervis Tetch is a pedophile. While no Batman story has ever revolved around Tetch assaulting minors in that way, during the events of Robin Year 1, he did mind control several children into sex trafficking as per a contract given to him by Syngman Lee. Number 3. Professor Pig. Professor Pig is a relatively new addition to Batman's rogues gallery, but one who managed to intimate his credentials pretty much instantly by carrying out some of the most heinous acts in Gotham's 2 centuries-long history. Created by Grant Morrison and Andy Kubert, Pig is a deranged murderer who possesses a menacing aesthetic and a horrifying modus operandi to capture innocents, mutilate their bodies, and turn them into his own willing slaves, which he calls Dolatrons. Batfans got their first real taste of Pig during Batman and Robin Reborn, where the villain and his brainwashed minions took over Gotham Circus, the same one seen in The Killing Joke in fact, and captured Damian Wayne. The new Robin narrowly avoids the transformation process, which involves Pig's victims having their genitals removed and a mask getting fused to their face. Needless to say, I have never looked at a pig in the same way ever again. Number 2. The Dealer. Before Scott Snyder terrorized Bat fans with Death of the Family in the New 52, the writer carved out his niche in the pages of Detective Comics, working on the criminally overlooked Black Mirror with artists Jock and Francesco Francavilla. The first story arc revolved around something known as the Mirror House, an underground auction that sold off the most depraved artifacts in Gotham's criminal history. They'd roam the city, setting up shop in the most horrific locales possible, usually sites where a major atrocity had been committed, and trade. Dick Grayson infiltrates the society, only to get found out just as he comes face to face with the Dealer, a decrepit old man who organizes the Mirror House's auctions and who is trying to auction off the crowbar that killed Jason Todd. The Dealer's obsession with the most depraved acts of history is pretty disturbing, and the fact he seems to get a thrill from it makes it all the more worse. Admittedly, a lot of the mystique and horror that accompanies the character can be traced back to Jock's creepy pencils, but there's something uniquely horrific about a man obsessed with the worst humanity has to offer. And number 1, the Joker. Could it honestly have been anyone else? The Joker, the clown prince of crime himself, is Batman's greatest adversary. He's also the most evil villain in the character's rogues gallery, with Joker having engaged in the worst crimes known to man at various points over the years. His terror doesn't discriminate, and neither does his evil. Anyone could be a target, either the Dark Knight's closest allies, or even just an unfortunate passerby. Joker may have once been portrayed as a comedic foil to Batman during the Silver Age of comics, but his particular brand of evil was made apparent right from the start. He's a cold-blooded murderer who's taken the lives of thousands, and yet he's somehow entertaining and terrifying at the exact same time. Whether he's sparring with the Caped Crusader or taking his cruelty to whole new heights, there's a reason why the Joker is considered so scary, and it's not just because he's over 6.5 foot tall. Jesus Christ, that is terrifying. Both visually speaking and in terms of what he's gone up to in the decades since his first appearance, no Batman villain could possibly compare in terms of just how much he exudes evil. The lack of motive, alias, or origin only compounds the Clown Prince's terror further, and Bat fans wouldn't have it any other way.